Hello! Today we are going to talk about dealing with scrappy patterns. This is another thing that I get a lot of questions about because when you're dealing with regular patterns with yardage, we all kind of conceptually have an understanding of how we get to those fabric requirements and cutting instructions, right? You take yardage, you cut it into strips, and then you cut those strips down from there. With scrappy patterns, it's a little bit different because there are not defined pieces of yardage that you're working with. People are just pulling from whatever they happen to have. And so the rules around fabric requirements and cutting instructions and how to kind of organize and deal with that kind of a pattern are just a little bit different than from regular patterns. And a lot of people just tend to struggle with this a little bit. So I'm going to be talking through some tips and tricks that I have learned over the years as a tech editor and ghostwriter that will hopefully help you when you go to write your scrappy patterns, because I'm definitely seeing an uptick in popularity in these patterns, especially this time of year. It seems like January and February, people are like gung-ho about sewing their stash and making resolutions to not buy any new fabric for the year. And so if you've ever thought of writing one, hopefully these tips will help you figure out how to organize it as best as possible. Alrighty, so let's talk about dealing with the fabric requirements first, because that is one of the more difficult things. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. Obviously, you have to provide some quantity estimates. You can't just be like, use your scraps. How many scraps? Who knows? Just use your scraps, right? Like you've got to provide some guidelines. And so there's a couple of ways that you can do this. Obviously, you can provide some yardage estimates, right? And people can kind of guesstimate from there. If you're going to do that though, you want to add plenty of buffer for those yardage estimates. You don't just want to have, the minimum of 2 inches that I usually recommend for regular yardage patterns. You want to add a little bit of extra buffer, because if people are just kind of pulling their scraps to amalgamate to this total amount of yardage, there's going to be some inefficiency in the way that they cut. And also some pieces might not be big enough to get that, little 4-inch strip that they need to get out of it. They might not be able to cut everything they need. And so if you're going to use yardage estimates, make sure you add quite a bit of buffer there. I'm talking like 10 to 12 inches at least, if not a little bit more. You want to estimate a little bit higher so that when those inefficiencies come in as they're just kind of hacking away at their scraps, it's accounted for, right? They don't end up with not enough fabric and have to go out and buy some for this scrappy quilt, which kind of defeats the purpose of it in the first place, right? The second way you can kind of do this is not super common, but I've actually done this with the pattern that you see on the left there. That's wonky woven, and it is one of my scrappy patterns. And that is to use a weight estimate rather than a yardage estimate. The reason this is nice is because a lot of times when we've got scrappy yardage, it's just like in a bin together, right? It's really, really difficult to estimate how much that adds up to in terms of yardage. Versus weight, you can just grab a kitchen scale or a bathroom scale, dump it in a bowl, and you have some estimation of how much yardage you need. And so you can actually put weights of fabric rather than yardage of fabric in your fabric requirements for some scrappy quilts. And if you're going to do that, a good rule of thumb is about 6.2 ounces per yard of fabric. That varies a little bit depending on the brand and weight of fabric that you're using. So heavier linens are going to be more like 7 or 8 ounces per yard. Really light, thin quilt cotton, like Art Gallery Studio fabrics, it's got that really nice buttery soft feel that's very, very thin, closer to like 4 to 5 ounces a yard, but 6.2 is like kind of a good middle range. Again, there's a little bit of buffer worked in there because there's inefficiencies when you're cutting down your scraps and all of that good stuff that we've already talked about. But about 6 ounces per yard of fabric that you need is a good way to kind of translate the fabric requirements into a weight, something they can actually measure without having to like lay out the pieces in their scrap bin to try and guesstimate that way. Another way that you can do this is to kind of put an approximate scrap size or minimum scrap size on the back cover. You want to be careful doing this because if it's a fairly simple pattern, people can kind of get the cutting dimensions and get the math that they need out of the pattern from your pattern without buying it. So if you're giving too much information away here, I wouldn't recommend doing this. But sometimes if you've got like fabric requirements where you've got like a yardage or a weight estimate, like we've already talked about, it is also helpful to add an approximate scrap size or a minimum scrap size to that. So people know when they're sorting through their scrap bins, these ones can work for this quilt. I can add them to kind of the total that I have. These ones will not, and I should not include them in my estimates. And so something like this might just be a note on the back that says, minimum scrap size 2.5 inches square or 4.5 inches square, whatever happens to be, right? If you've got a range, you've got some small pieces that are 2 inches square, you've got, some that are 10 inches square, you need some larger scraps, indicate that. So again, people can figure out what exactly they need for this quilt pattern and figure out if what they have in their stash is compatible with it before they dive in and buy it and start making it. The last kind of tip that I have, and these are not mutually exclusive, right? You can use multiple of these tips at the same time, is to include color buckets in your fabric requirements. If you're doing Scrappy, you're not using all of one fabric for the entire quilt, right? You're going to use lots of different kinds of fabrics, but sometimes it's still helpful to kind of bucket those into lights, mediums, and darks. Or in wonky woven, like you see here, I've bucketed into like accent and background fabrics. That just helps your customer kind of figure out how to sort their scraps and get it organized into a fashion so they end up with something that they're happy with. Okay, so that's kind of all I have as far as dealing with the fabric requirements. Let's talk about some other elements of Scrappy quilts that are helpful to think about. All right, for cutting tables, these are, again, going to look a little bit different than they do for a traditional quilt pattern because we're not taking yardage and cutting it down. So you're not going to list, quantities of strips and then subcuts from those strips like you normally would. We're going to break that rule here a little bit. Normally I recommend doing that, but we got to break it here a little bit because we're not cutting down yardage more often than not, right? Like people are just pulling whatever they've got. And so rather than strips and subcuts, you just kind of want to list quantities and dimensions here, right? And so what you see in this table are just like 16 3.5-inch squares, 32 6.5-inch squares. Those might all be matching. They may not be matching, but they're all from the same color bucket and people are just kind of whatever fits into that color bucket, they're just cutting down their scraps as they can. That's a distinct difference from regular yardage patterns. The second tip I've kind of already mentioned here, and that is to provide some information in the pattern about taming the chaos. A lot of quilters find Scrappy patterns really, really intimidating, especially kind of the newer, more modern quilters. A lot of those folks really love the look of a really well done Scrappy quilt, but as far as like wrapping their head around how to plan it and how to do it for themselves from their own stash, that can be really difficult. And so it's really helpful if you're writing a Scrappy pattern to kind of have, a planning section or an about the design section that kind of goes through this process of like, here's how you want to pull fabrics. Here's how you tell if they look good together. Here's how you tell if you need to eliminate one of them. Here are the colors you can work with, right? Like providing those kinds of guidelines of like, pull these specific colors from your scrap. Don't try to use everything in your scrap bin. Information that is really helpful to them to kind of tame that chaos and end up with something they love, which isn't something that may necessarily come naturally to them, is really, really helpful. That can boost the popularity of the pattern so much because people will see a quilt, they'll love it, and they'll go, I'm going to make that. And then they get the pattern, they open it up and they're like, whoa, hang on, this is more than I bargained for. I don't know what to do with this. Like, I'm just kind of stumped. And that's enough inertia to prevent them from ever making the quilt pattern, which is not what you want, right? You want people purchasing your patterns and making your quilts. And that just kind of adds to the social proof of your brand and your business, right? So getting people to actually make the pattern, not just purchase the pattern, is really important. And when it comes to Scrappy quilts, kind of providing that key information to really help them get over that kind of hump of figuring out how to tame the chaos can be really, really critical. Alrighty, I hope that stuff was helpful. If you've got any other questions about dealing with these kinds of Scrappy patterns, let me know. I would love to answer them. I will be back next Tuesday with another Tech Tip Tuesday. Until then, see you then.